It has been 3 weeks since the four materials cypress, concrete with steel, aluminum, and granite has been left in the open air, exposed to the weather, sun, and the lives around it. They were baked and watered every other day to accelerate the weathering. I revisited the materials after the rainstorm. After the wet sky releases its weight, creation and destruction occurs simultaneously. When I opened the door to the backyard, the scent of rain and soil was mixed with a metallic note from my materials. Starting with cypress, when I first acquired this wood, it had sharp corners, gave splinters, and had light grains. After 3 weeks of weathering and being wet, the grain of the cypress were accentuated. The wood was softer and the corners were slightly rounded. The charred cypress. When it was first charred, the mark of fire left a smoky scent that lingered around it and could be smelled from a few feet away. This charred cypress was almost a uniform black, but after the rain, the smell disappeared, and the color of the uncharred cypress was coming through. The cypress now has a powdery finish, and the corners were further chipped away, as those were the spots the fire touched the most. Cypress with nails. 3 weeks before, when the nails were just placed into the cypress, the moment of contact between the wood and nail were hardly noticeable, but now the nail has rusted, and the contact between the wood and nail was darkened and further emphasized due to weathering. Concrete with steel. When the concrete was first cast, the surface was smooth and uniform. Now the porosity of the concrete was further emphasized as the rain slowly carved into the surface, accentuating the pores and the little cradles. The nail's rust has also melted onto the surface of the concrete. When it was first cast, the rockite covered the stones completely, hiding the presence of those materials. But as 3 weeks went by, part of the rockite covering the large stones were chipped off, revealing more of the stones. The aggregate gives an uneven texture to the concrete. It would be interesting to see how this unevenness will further influence weathering. Aluminum. 3 weeks ago, the aluminum had an even, mirror-like reflection. There were no marks on its perfect surface. However, this mirror-like surface would highlight any slight mark. Thus, by 3 weeks, the fragility of the mirror-like surface was easily scratched and marked. Instead of viewing this as a tarnish, I found myself pondering. These small marks made the aluminum more interesting. I began to wonder what caused these marks, and when did it take place. Granite. The block of granite I found was already weathered. It has been used as an essential piece in a dry masonry wall. It must have been there for many years, possibly decades. Before I placed the granite outside, I washed the granite to reveal more of its grain, colors, and textures. 3 weeks later, I was surprised to find that the weathering returned, concealing the granite's grains and textures once again. The documentation and study of these four materials and how they chip, color, and mold, and react will further be recorded. Each day adds a layer of time to these materials and presents new opportunities for change or resistance. The unexpected and expected are both welcome. Alongside the weathering of the four materials, 5 case studies has been analyzed to further understand weathering in post-occupancy. The 5 case studies were broken into the categories of cultural, architectural, artistic, societal, and technological. The Ise Shrine is one of a few shrines in temples across Japan that honor the presence of impermanence. The sacred shrine has 2 plots of land. Every 20 years, the shrine will be disassembled and active maintenance, and a new shrine will be built on a site nearby. This is an act of maintenance, but it's also a way of passing building techniques and tradition down to a future generation. As of 2013, this process has been done 62 times in a span of 1,240 years. Using the agency of film, we could condense the rebuilding and disassembly to be faster and faster, until finally each rebuilding and disassembly becomes a flicker adjacent to each other, and one cannot distinguish construction and maintenance. Thus, construction and maintenance are equal. Unlike the ECA Shrine, which is meant to be timeless, the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art is a piece of architecture that is meant to embody and mark the 6 editions in a span of 33 years by the same architect, Wohlher and Bolt. The museum is a direct understanding of post-occupancy, societal shift, and the architecture's response to it. With each edition, the client requests the new edition to respond to the current interests of art. As a result, we see a fluctuation in interest of art throughout the 3 decades. Wohlher and Bolt were extremely sensitive to the typography, thus positioning each edition best in relationship to the landscape. By the 6th edition, the museum has closed its loop. Thus, the sequence through the museum is a correlation to the experience of 6 moments of art in a span of 33 years. However, with each edition, the museum becomes more introverted. The 1st edition placed all artwork within the landscape as backdrop, but the 6th edition rejected any presence of the place and context. Like the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art, Titus Mosley, a Pittsburgh-based sculptor, also works with the idea of layered time. Mosley finds already weathered wood in lumber mills or simply lying around. Seeing potential in these logs, he begins to work on them. Each strike of a hammer on a chisel marks a duration of time on these sculptures. Thus, the mark of a craftsman becomes an expression of time. He further adds another layer of time to a sculpture by leaving them out in open air to further weather and to accept the life around it. Materials shape the ages. We see this in 30,000 BCE with the Stone Age, 3000 BCE with the Bronze Age, and so on. Observing on a local scale, we witnessed this in the 1800s in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Prior to the establishment of the steel mill in the 1970s, Homestead was a slow-growing town. However, as Homestead Mill was established, an instant change was clear. The steel mill created a society as more people moved to be near the mill. Blue-collar workers all took the same trail to work and back home. Their children grew up around the presence of the mill. The mill could be heard, smelled, and tasted from afar. Thus, the mill became the heart of the homestead. The agency of mapping is used to reveal the development of the steel mill and its ripple on the scale of urban fabric and in the individual life of the society that it created over time. Lastly, but certainly not least, OMA's 2014 Venice Biennale Pavilion confront us with a section of a modern-day commercial building with a load-dominated mechanical and technological system. These are the fundamental and elements of quote-unquote architecture that makes up a notable portion of buildings today. With current society obsessed with instant comfort and ease, the fundamental of architecture greatly changed. If we place ourselves in the architecture masterpiece, the Pantheon, the fundamentals of architecture is clear: light, time, space, material, and proportions, and so on. The modern-day obsession with permanence and the desire for instant comfort threatens the presence and elements of architecture. With each decade and technology that removes us from the context and the natural environment, the mechanical system and floors get thicker and thicker, lowering the architecture spaces. As Alvar Aalto asks, what will his buildings look like in 30 years? How will the Pantheon be experienced in 30 years? What about 60? And will it be fully erased in 90 years, eaten away by the mechanical system as society continues to find a way to try to resist time and weathering?